Imagine you're standing outside a gatehouse at midnight in January, somewhere in Northumberland. The wind is sharp enough to cut a confession out of a stone. Your cloak is damp, your boots are worse than useless, and the only thing stiffer than your fingers is the body of the last man who stood this post and didn't make it to sunrise. Welcome to Night Watch in the Middle Ages, not some noble vigil, but a slow-motion punishment, parceled out by the hour, bone-deep and quietly homicidal. They didn't call it guard duty, not really. It was more like you were put on the wall, the way a carcass is put on a spit, and it wasn't just castles. Towns had watchmen, monasteries had porters, manors had reeves with sore knees and no gloves. Most weren't soldiers. They were peasants with a pike, or old mercenaries whose best weapon was complaining. And their worst enemy wasn't the arrow or the axe. It was the cold, the kind that doesn't kill quickly, just breaks your resolve like rotted timber. Now, before you romanticize it, let's clarify. The average medieval guard post didn't come with a nice brazier or hot stew delivered hourly by some cheerful kitchen boy. No. If there was a brazier, it was probably stolen by the last guy, or so full of ashes it smoked more than it burned. The food? Dried peas and regrets. Heat? You were the heat. Move or die. Simple as that. So how did they survive? Let's start with the obvious cheat code. They didn't. Always. Coroner's rolls from England, the grim little shopping lists of death, tell us about men found frozen, hard as horn, by the walls of Dover. A town watchman in 1310 was found face down in a puddle of his own frozen vomit outside Bristol. They logged it as misadventure, which is a polite way of saying the ale wore off before he made it home. But for those who did manage to stay alive, it came down to a few brutal tactics. First, layers. Not the sleek thermal gear of today, but a grotesque patchwork of wool, linen, leather, and fur, stitched together with hope and filth. In Novgorod, Russia, where winter laughs in 6 languages, guards were issued boots stuffed with moss and hair fur. And when that froze solid, you peed on it. Warm for a minute, stank for a week. Survival isn't elegant. In northern monasteries, where monks pulled double duty as gatekeepers, records show something called soccus duplicatus, double socks. Latin for, we hate frostbite, but not enough to buy mittens. Cloisters handed out fur-lined hoods and fingerless gloves, so you could turn the page or ring the bell even if your knuckles cracked open like old bread. One monk in York wrote bitterly of night vigils in the bitter air, where our prayers steamed from our mouths like incense from the damned. No word on whether God answered. Then there was movement, the medieval version of doing jumping jacks quietly enough not to wake the nobleman upstairs. Pacing was key. Guards would walk circuits, not just to patrol, but to keep their blood from becoming decorative ice. In Italian city-states, mercenary guards were paid per passus by the step. No movement, no pay. Try calling in frozen. And yet, ironically, stillness was often forced. In castles, you couldn't abandon your post. That was desertion. A crime that could get you whipped, fined, or nailed by the ears to the gate you abandoned. In France, a night watchman named Guy de Montigny tried to warm himself in a nearby stable. He was found asleep next to the horses and sentenced to a day in the stocks with snow down his shirt, public humiliation with a chill. So they adapted. Guards learned to build micro-shelters, straw-packed nooks inside gate towers, body-sized and lined with animal hides. In Scandinavian outposts, they burned dried dung and fish oil in crude lanterns. The smell could raise the dead, but the heat might keep you among the living. One Danish record from 1,273 notes, a sentry's box made of barrel staves and wool sacks, essentially a coffin you could sit in, if you didn't mind smelling like a damp sheep. And you were never truly alone, not because anyone cared, but because guards doubled as deterrents. You weren't watching the gate. You were the warning, wrapped in rags, half frozen. You were living proof of what happened to anyone who crossed the Lord, or the weather. There's a magnificent little horror hidden in the records of Prague, 1356. A royal edict required all city guards to shout the hour loudly at every quarter through the night. If a guard missed his cue, he was assumed dead, drunk, or in dereliction. Either way, the penalty was flogging or fines. Picture it. You're barely conscious, your teeth are chattering in Morse code, and you have to belt out 12 o'clock and all's well, like a frostbitten town crier. Miss it? You might get more warmth from the lash than from your blanket. Which, by the way, you likely didn't have. The English ordinances of 1242 set out the equipment for castle sentries: sword, buckler, horn, and nothing remotely soft. Comfort was treason to readiness. You were supposed to be alert, not cozy. Any heat was seen as indulgence, and indulgence, like most sins, was punishable. But let's not pretend there weren't workarounds. Corruption, as always, did more for survival than any prayer. In Paris, a street patrol was found to have hired a beggar to stand in for them during the coldest hours in exchange for half a loaf and a promise not to get caught. He did. The loaf was revoked. The guards were demoted. The beggar died that night. Justice was precise, if not merciful. Then there were the drinks. Oh yes, the drinks. Mulled wine, boiled ale, mead laced with spices, and whatever other fermented firewater was available. A warm belly was a poor substitute for boots, but sometimes it bought you an hour or two before your toes turned black. The problem, of course, was falling asleep. Sleep and cold are siblings. They lull you in tandem, and nothing got you killed faster than nodding off in the snow, unless it was waking up next to someone who had. In Lubeck, 1394, 2 guards were found huddled together in a watchtower, deadlocked in an embrace that looked tender until you read the footnote. Frozen thus, presumed sodomy. Bodies burned. The church found sin in every thawed moment. Even in death, you weren't safe from accusation. But the worst punishment was survival itself. To wake up frostbitten, fingerless, limping, and know you'd be back on the wall tomorrow. The records don't capture the sound of teeth clicking in the wind, or the stink of unwashed wool steamed by sweat and desperation, but they do record the punishments for guards who tried to dodge their shift. In one Burgundian town, a man faked his own illness to skip night duty only to be sentenced to 6 nights naked at the gate, chained and watched. His illness, it turned out, wasn't fake by the end. Yet the cold wasn't just weather, it was a weapon. Lords knew it. Cities used it. Watchposts were often tests, not just of vigilance but loyalty. If you froze, you proved you didn't belong. If you survived, maybe, just maybe, you earned the right to suffer again tomorrow. Because in the medieval world, death was part of the job description. But frostbite? That was a rite of passage. A badge worn in blackened fingers and shattered toes. A price you paid for keeping someone else's gate shut. And maybe that's the most medieval part of it. Not the weather, but the quiet agreement beneath it all. That pain was proof of duty. That freezing was a kind of fidelity. And that the only warmth you could count on came from the fire you weren't allowed to build. So when we ask how they survived the cold, we're really asking something else. How much suffering did the system allow before it noticed you were gone? And the answer? About as much as a corpse could bear, until it started to stink. You want warmth? Join the clergy. Not because God cared more, he didn't, but because monasteries kept better inventory. In the rule of St. Benedict, monks were promised a wool tunic, a cowl for winter, and get this, undergarments, a luxury so rare among commoners it might as well have been unicorn hide. Even then, those garments were doled out seasonally, like privileges for good behavior. A friar in Lincoln once wrote that his winter robe smelled of damp sheep and old onions, but he thanked God anyway. Because unlike the guards outside, he wasn't bleeding from the nose from frozen air. Now consider the town of Danzig a bustling, Hanseatic city with icy winds that could sandblast your soul. The winter of 1407 was so vicious that the city council authorized emergency warming rights for guards. 1 fire per gatehouse per night. But lighting that fire was another matter. Coal was expensive. Wood was rationed. So guards burned whatever they had. Scrap rope, splintered barrels, stolen fence posts. In one case, the entire door to the privy was sacrificed to keep a single brazier going. Civic hygiene be damned, nobody wants to freeze with their trousers down. And then there was the buddy system. Unofficial, unspoken, but absolutely essential. You didn't survive alone. You paired off, leaned on each other, took turns pacing and warming, not for comfort, but to avoid slipping into the death sleep that crept up behind you like a debt collector. A French ordinance from 1365 insisted that city watches be done in pairs, so one may keep the other from sloth or freezing. Translation: if you die, make sure someone's alive to explain it. But buddy or not, the cold still found you. It seeped into your teeth and settled in your joints, and the longer you stood still, the more your own armor betrayed you. Yes, armor. Because some guards, especially in wealthy towns or during wartime, wore partial plate or mail. It looked impressive, until the metal froze. Imagine cold iron strapped to your limbs like meat lockers. One guard in Mainz had his foot nearly amputated by his own greave. The leather ties froze, swelled, and cut off circulation. The surgeon called it a miracle. The guard called it a Tuesday. You could file complaints. Sure, they had forms for that. But God help you if you use them. In Milan, 1381, a city watchman petitioned for better provision against the winter air. His reward? A sermon on fortitude, a smaller cloak, and permanent night duty. You didn't complain to survive, you complained to get noticed. And in the medieval world, being noticed usually meant someone was about to solve your problem by removing you from it. Still, innovation found its way in. In the Alps, guards developed something called the Wärmestein, literally, warm stone. You'd heat a rock in the hearth before your shift, wrap it in cloth, and stuff it in your tunic. By the time it cooled, you were halfway through your rotation, or halfway dead. In Bohemia, similar tactics involved baked bricks or flat irons. One record from 1412 describes a guard rotating 3 such stones all night, like a chicken upon eggs. At least the chicken gets to sit down. Meanwhile, London, always eager to complicate things, came up with the world's least helpful compromise. In 1325, the sheriffs issued an ordinance requiring all gate guards to be inspected mid-watch by a warden, ostensibly to ensure vigilance, but really to see if they were still alive. If they weren't, the warden got to keep their wages, which meant some wardens were a little slow to perform their checks. Nothing saves on payroll like a frozen employee. And there were rules about posture, too. You couldn't sit. You couldn't huddle. You couldn't lean against the wall, lest someone think you were dozing. In Bruges, a town statute required guards to stand erect, as if summoned to God's judgment. Very poetic, until you realize that standing still in snow at 3 a.m. is about as close to divine judgment as it gets. One chronicler dryly noted that more guards died upright than in battle. We call that posture. They called it discipline. You may be wondering, what about women? Did they ever stand watch? In most places, no. But in emergencies, siege, plague, manpower shortages, they did. In 1349, during a particularly nasty outbreak of the Black Death, several women in Frankfurt were pressed into gate duty. No armor, no weapons, no training. Just a staff, a bell, and a fur cape that had belonged to the last guy. One woman, Gertrude Meissner, survived 3 nights before collapsing. The city noted her death. Her name? Misspelled. Priorities. And don't forget, the animals had it better. Guard dogs, prized for their hearing and their fur, were often given blankets, sometimes even heated stalls. In Norway, sled dogs assigned to border posts were treated with more concern than the men holding the torches. There's a royal edict from 1377 complaining that 2 dogs were kept in warmth while 3 men froze without meat. That's not exaggeration. That's a line item in the king's correspondence. Of course, The guards weren't always victims. Sometimes they were the punishment. A thief in Lübeck might be sentenced to 3 nights on the wall instead of the pillory. Public cold, not public shame. They called it frost justice. One man was given the option of flogging or guarding a wind-blasted tower on New Year's Eve. He chose the flogging. It was faster. Because here's the twisted truth. Cold was a tool of order. It sorted the loyal from the weak. It weeded out the coward, the drunk, the incompetent, or just the unlucky. It didn't discriminate. The cold was democratic, in a way the feudal system never was. Nobles had hearths. You had hoarfrost. But perhaps the cruelest thing the cold did was make you disappear. Frozen corpses shrank, curled in on themselves, became smaller than memory. A man who died in the field might be buried. A man who died on the wall might just be replaced. In a Welsh castle record from 1303, a sentry is listed simply as missing after snow. No search, no funeral, just a dash, and then a new name in the next line. Like he'd been scraped off the ledger the way a boot scrapes slush off stone. Still, some endured. Some guards made it year after year. They weren't stronger, just meaner. They knew every trick. Chewed raw onions to keep the blood moving. Tied hot coals in cloth and carried them like sacred relics. Slept in shifts with one eye open and the other frozen shut. They called themselves icemen, not affectionately, but because their joints made the sound of cracking ice every time they moved. And when they retired, if they lived that long, they didn't get pensions. They got stories, most of them lies. But one truth always crept in. I stood the gate when others ran. I survived the cold, which, in the end, was all they could claim. Because in the medieval world, warmth wasn't a right. It was a reward. And if you didn't bleed, freeze, or beg for it, you probably didn't deserve it. The cold wasn't the enemy, it was the test, and no one wanted to know the results. You ever wonder why so many medieval gatehouses were built like stone coffins? Low ceilings, narrow halls, wind slicing through arrow slits like God's own razor. That wasn't bad design. That was the point. A cold guard was an alert guard. Or so the logic went, a sort of architectural sadism masquerading as strategy. Comfort bred complacency. Freeze the bastards, and they'll stay sharp, or die trying. Take Edinburgh Castle. In the winter of 1422, the outer gate was manned by 2 men at all times. The post was nicknamed the Lungs, not because of the view, but because every exhale came out like smoke and didn't come back in. Chroniclers wrote that men would return from the night watch looking 10 years older. One's beard froze so stiff, it snapped off mid-shift. He kept it in a pouch and called it a relic. It was the most sacred thing he owned. Now don't mistake this for neglect. This was policy. Institutionalized frostbite. Military discipline written in chilblains and blackened toes. There were even training guides. The Livre des Métiers of Paris advised that a watchman should be of sturdy build, known for sobriety and not prone to sleep in cold, which is like hiring a baker who doesn't blink in flour. Ideal, but increasingly mythical. And what did the authorities offer in return? Oaths, promises, the kind that came wrapped in wax seals and vanished with the next frost. A 15th century English manual for watch captains included the phrase, "Care for your men as you would your steed." Right. Only most knights wouldn't let their horses stand in sleet for 6 hours without food or cover. You cared for your men the same way you cared for firewood, useful until it cracked. Even the church got in on it. Sermons preached that enduring the cold without complaint was a form of holy penance. That suffering cleansed the soul. That frost was God's test, which made the gatepost into a kind of altar, a place where faith and exposure met, and only one came away unscathed. A Dominican preacher in Lübeck compared the night watch to the Passion of Christ. Easy to say from the pulpit, harder to remember when your fingers are too stiff to make the sign of the cross. Let's not forget the real joke here. The people being protected by these freezing wretches often didn't care. Townsfolk slept warm under eiderdowns and sheepskin, with a passing thought of, I hope the guards don't freeze. Nobles dreamed in canopied beds, while the man 2 floors down lost another toe. There's a letter from a merchant in Cologne thanking the night patrol for keeping the rogues at bay, while simultaneously lobbying to reduce their pay. Gratitude, medieval style, thank you for suffering, now do it for less. There were, occasionally, gestures. A noble might send out mulled wine. A lady of the manor might donate a few old cloaks. One abbess in Brabant gave mittens to the gate guards every Christmas. She knitted them herself. They were far too small. Most men wore them as ear warmers or stuffed them down their shirts like talismans. One chronicler dryly noted, her piety exceeded her sense of proportion. And then there were the songs. Yes, songs. Not for joy, but rhythm. A way to keep moving, keep awake. Guards sang in low voices, half to themselves, half to the walls. Repetitive, crude, often obscene. Lyrics about frostbitten privates and stew that tasted like rope. One verse from a Burgundian barracks goes, my nose is black, my balls are blue, and still the Lord says, guard that view. It wasn't art, it was survival poetry. But the cold didn't just torment the body, it stripped the mind. Long shifts in silent frost led to what modern psychologists might call sensory deprivation. Back then, they called it gate madness. Guards reported seeing lights in the snow, hearing whispers in the ice. One record from Krakow mentions a watchman who began reciting Latin backwards and licking the stone floor. He was relieved of duty. 2 days later, his replacement did the same thing. The city council simply posted a third man with a crucifix and a goatskin flask of wine. Problem solved. And here's the kicker. Most of these men weren't professional guards. They were drafted townsfolk. Bakers, coopers, tanners conscripted by Rota to stand the wall. You weren't paid unless you were permanent staff. The rest? Civic duty. A tax in time and toes. Skip your night? Pay a fine. Complain? Get bumped up the Rota. One particularly vengeful magistrate in Ghent wrote that repeat whiners should be assigned to the windward gate, where only the crows remain cheerful. So they adapted. They cheated. They bribed. Fake illnesses. Dead relatives. Bogus visions. One man in Dijon claimed he couldn't stand watch because his humors froze unpredictably. He produced a bottle of cloudy urine as evidence. The judge laughed and sentenced him to 2 nights without boots for taking the piss too literally. Still, through all of it, through the madness, the frostbite, the indifference of lords and saints, some guards took pride in their misery. There was a kind of brutal dignity in it, a self-made nobility forged in sleet and spite. One watchman in York was buried with his staff and horn. The epitaph read, "He never slept and never warmed." It was meant as praise. Or maybe a warning, because that's the final cruelty. If you lasted long enough, you became the cautionary tale. The old man by the fire, muttering about frost demons and silent feet in the snow. Kids would call you Ice Eyes. Women would nod politely. You'd been on the wall so long, you were part of it. And maybe that's what the medieval world wanted. Not guards, but monuments. Living statues of obedience and chill. Men so disciplined they'd freeze before they'd fail. So forgettable. They could be replaced before the corpse cooled. So how did they survive? They didn't. Not really. They endured. They rotted slowly. They became part of the stone, not just holding the gate, becoming it. Cold, silent, replaceable. And that, in the end, was the job. The wall didn't need you to live. It needed you to stand. And if you froze doing it, good. You were easier to sculpt that way.